Hi, I'm Tom Stephenson and welcome to Construction Project Management PM Tips. Today we're going to be talking about lean construction, but really looking at the 8 areas of waste. And today's session is particularly going to be looking at defects. So if you've watched this channel before, you'll know that I talk a lot about lean construction practices as well as all construction practices and planning, scheduling, project management, MS project. If you haven't subscribed, please take a look at the various playlists that I have, and I think you'll find that if you're in the area of construction management, any area of construction, you'll find that this channel is really helpful for you. Okay, so let's get started. Today we're going to be looking at the 8 areas of waste, as I mentioned, and you might not be familiar with them. And so these are actually taken from the Toyota production system, lean manufacturing. They've been adopted to lean construction practices, but it doesn't really matter. It's just construction. We have waste. We have a lot of waste in construction. We have upwards of 35% of the direct kind of waste that you think about when we talk about waste. And so these can be categorized into a nice sort of way that you can remember them, the 8 areas of waste. They actually, if you look at the first letter of all of the 8 areas, they actually spell the word downtime. So I'll have a little circle that'll come up after on that, but they spell the word downtime. So it helps you to remember them. I think in construction, we very often kind of look past it and just walk by it and not think about it. But there is a lot of waste. There's a lot of waste in everything that we do. You know, I'm a college professor. I teach construction management. I can see waste all over the place, you know, with how schedules are done and how things have to be redone and how this can be very upsetting for people. So I think in every environment we have these things that we have to deal with. But what I can tell you in the world of construction, if you learn to reduce, and lean would say eliminate, because it's a never-ending goal, right? Waste, and you're better than your competitors, you're going to have a competitive advantage. You're going to do well. You're going to do well as an individual, and you're going to do well in your careers. So the 8 areas of waste are defects, overproduction, waiting, non-utilized talent, transportation of goods, inventory, motion, and extra processing steps. Today, we're just going to unpack defects. So I'm going to have a series of 8 of these videos where I'm going to unpack each one of them. This is me when I was, I think I was probably about 20 there. I got married pretty young, and this was my house, and I wanted to build a front porch on it. And being 20, buying my first house in the city of Toronto, even though if you looked at what it cost back then, today you'd think it was like, you know, so cheap, but at that time it was still fairly expensive for what you made. And so of course I wanted to save a little bit of money, and so we excavated it by hand. That's my father-in-law and niece and nephew off to the side, and so we excavated it by hand. And I can talk about waste or defects and problems that I had. You know, I was 20 years old. How much did I really know at that time? But I was definitely eager. I'd been in construction since I was about 12, so I could lay blocks, I could lay bricks, I could do stonework, I could do carpentry at that stage. Probably not great at project management yet, working on that side of things. And so I remember laying these blocks up, and I remember because of all the excess dirt, what I did was we put the blocks around after we had the footings down. This had to be, in Toronto, you have to dig down at least 4 feet below the frost line. And so what I wanted to do was get rid of all the earth by filling it back up inside, right? Because it had no cold room or anything in the room. It was just going to be a porch. And so I started to fill it up, you know, and this is a few days after the blocks were set up. And that was fine. The problem was I got a little bit greedy. There was extra dirt and I didn't want to have to take it away. So I put a hose in behind the wall. Well, luckily I only had the backup block on, but basically what happened was I remember having a coffee and watching it slowly, these joints opening up like a little crack. And it was hydrostatic pressure against the wall that was slowly moving the wall. And of course, that basically meant that the whole thing had to be taken down. It pretty much fell down by the time the water did its job on it. And then through all the mud and everything, I had to redo the blocks. So it was a lot of extra work, and that was a big defect that I created in that process. Another interesting one is this is the finished porch. And so I always remember this column over here. So the columns, you know, they're a little bit tricky. This is a natural stone called Kingston. It's out of Kingston, Ontario, and very beautiful looking stone. I remember these nice marble caps that we got for a steal. I remember they were $60 each at the time, and it was really great. But I remember that I was a little bit short on the stone, so at the bottom here, on top of a poured concrete column, I had a little bit of help from mason that I worked with way back in the day, and he was very good, but sometimes he might like to take a little shortcut. And I remember, because we didn't have all that much stone, he said, well, we'll put a couple of rows of brick below here, and then we'll build up the stone. Well, I didn't really know any better at the time, but my dad's there on the porch. So my dad had a lot of experience. Like, my dad he could make anything. And I remember we already had the column up, and he saw the brick at the bottom. He said, what'd you do? And I said, oh, well, we just put the brick. No, you don't want to put brick based next to the soil. It won't last, right? And so he was right. Like, it did last a long time, and it's still there. But I remember when I always looked at, like, because I dig around the earth, I could see a little bit of the bricks falling off over the years. And so, like, if I put the stone on top of the concrete, unless somebody hits it with a truck, it's going to last, 60 years, 70 years, easy. And so it's been about 30 something, but it is starting to deteriorate down there. And so, that was another defect that was easily resolved. Even if I used a concrete brick, it would have been fine, right? But not a clay brick. So these are little things, defects, right? And a lot of times they're defects that are more, that's a longevity one that really, for next to nothing, you can avoid. This is one that's instantaneous, and you could imagine, with a foundation wall, if you're backfilling a foundation wall and you haven't got it properly shored, or it's laterally unsupported, that would be a problem, right? And so these are things that you can mostly avoid when we talk about the 8 areas of waste, and there's our downtime there. I like to always explain things that I've made mistakes on, because I think it's good to know that you're not perfect. When I first started teaching, I was like kind of nervous to say mistakes that I made, but I found over the years that shows that you're human and that you do make mistakes. What's important is to try to learn from those mistakes. And better yet, watching a video like this, if that's taught you something about hydrostatic pressure, putting water against a wall that's basically not laterally supported, and what the outcomes could potentially be, then it's worth it. And that helps you not have to do all the digging and other things that I had to do in that particular case. Well worth your time on this video. So, when we look at things, and this is another example. So there's this up in Collingwood, which is about 2 hours away from me. They were doing a bunch of townhouses, and I'm watching, just going for walks every morning. It's what I do, and I'm watching this go on. Like, this was all backfilled, and then they had to redig it. You can kind of see where they put the drainage layer, because you can see that's clean and this is older. They had to redig this, because, and you can tell, like, you can look, right? Like, this isn't lining up with the door, and, well, number one, and number two, it wasn't wide enough. And so, these are things that, there's that adage that you say, basically, measure twice, cut once, right? It's very important, because when you have to do something like this again, it costs thousands of dollars. Or if you're prefabricating something and it's basically, and you're laying out columns, either the prefabrication process was off the measurements, or if the columns were put after this was prefabricated, then that's a problem. And so understanding quality issues and trying to really learn from these things. Like, you really want to do a root cause analysis, like, how did this happen? Why? And it's not about finger pointing. It's not trying to get at somebody. It's really trying to make sure that it doesn't happen again, right? You really want to try to avoid these things from happening again. And we can actually, there's a bunch of different areas that we could think about defects in, categories. And I would just encourage you not to look at this big vast list and start thinking, well, where would I ever start? You pick the one that's causing you the most problems right now, whichever one it might be. And it depends where you are, you know, in the spectrum of what's being done. If you're a tradesperson, what is getting you, you know, as far as things fitting and layout and measurements. If you're a designer, what's some of the issues that you have? So pick something that you really annoys you right now, causes problems, and where you can make a lot of improvements. That would be what I would strongly suggest. And so we have design errors, poor workmanship, incorrect measurements, faulty materials, inadequate site inspection, improper installation, environmental damage, structural failures, non-compliance standards, communication failures, site safety issues. I think I got that one twice there. Lack of training, and scheduling and coordination conflicts. All right, so just as a starting point. Design errors, you know, this is one of the, I have a lot of empathy towards designers these days because I feel like their work isn't valued enough and they're all rushed and they're on tight, compressed budgets because often owners don't see the value in the extra effort of paying the designers to really be thorough with their specifications and their designs, and also being able to collaborate. That's a lean side. You know, contract models much better where we get more collaboration early on in the project. So better than design bid build would be design build, would be construction management, better, and cost plus. Better than those would be integrated project delivery. So those are just different areas, but definitely poor, rushed, incomplete designs. Your biggest opportunity to save is in the early design process. That is where your biggest opportunity is to save. Poor workmanship, as I said, you know, rushed work, uncaring, cutting corners, lack of training, lack of supervision. You know, and lack of training would be kind of like me too. I would say lack of knowledge at that example that I gave you with the brickwork. If I'd known, I wouldn't have done it. Here, maybe some rushed work and basically the layout was incorrect, right? And so now what are you doing? Like, how did this get to this part? This was probably part design problem, probably part rushed work problem, right? And so then what was happening here is this had been excavated and poured, and then this is going to come out, and then they finish this off. So it's a lot of extra work again in that same subdivision. A lot of problems with stairs in that subdivision. There's another, I've got to dig it up. There's another one where you come out the front door and all the utilities are in front of the stairs, and I'm like, okay, so now you got to relocate the utilities, which they did, but it's a lot of extra work. So those are all things that you have to think about from that perspective. Here was an interesting one. And I've done another video on this hybrid bench, which I thought was wonderfully designed by the consultant. But essentially, in this particular case, this was a project where you're lowering the basement. And this was actually my daughter's place, and my son-in-law called me and said, oh, they've got it all done. Here's the picture. And the engineer's going to come tomorrow to verify that it's done correctly. Well, the engineer, the consulting firm, charges around $600 every time they make a trip. And so when they make a trip, they charge around $600. And if something's wrong, then they're going to tell them to correct it. And then they're going to have to come back again. All right. Because it's very strict when you're underpinning and lowering on a house. So looking at this, you could take a minute yourself. You know, it's pretty quick. You should be able, if you're used to looking at drawings. And if you're not, by the way, I've got a playlist of reading construction drawings that could be helpful. So if you click my face and you go to the playlist, you should be able to see the one on print reading. And so in this case, these are your rebar, and you can count pretty clearly 1, 2, 3, 4 cross members of the rebar. And here I only see 3. As well, it's not coming out near far enough. All right, so it's supposed to come out basically around, you know, you can deduct 2 inches from this side, you can deduct 2 inches from that side, so around 2 foot 2 inches. And so basically it had to come out further, and it had to have the other piece added on. So what I told my son-in-law was, well, call the consultant, the engineer, show him the picture and ask what's the fix. And of course he said splice pieces on the side and add the extra rebar. So you want to get that confirmation from the consultant from that perspective. And then he didn't, by the time he came the next morning, it was all fixed and you didn't have an extra trip and you didn't have a delay in the project. And it makes things a lot easier from that perspective. All right. Incorrect measurements we already mentioned, so that was an example of that, where you get incorrect measurements. Some of these are not mutually exclusive. They crisscross over each other. That's the thing with waste, is a lot of times one causes another, or simultaneously you've got different wastes going on that it ripples outward. Poor materials, poor quality shipment of materials, not really checking to verify that it's the correct materials, and then somebody installing it. It could also be that you have, so an example might be that you've got a roof flashing going in. The client wants black, and what gets shipped to the site is white, and then they install the white, but the client wanted black. And so then again, you end up either taking it out or they want a discount or something of that nature, right? So it's looking at, well, how does this happen and how can we avoid it in the future? It's going to happen, these things, in the beginning, and they're happening now for you. How do you get it to be less so? We're not going to get perfection right away. And I've done a video on perfection as well, right? Sometimes I hold off doing a video because I want to get it all crystallized, but sometimes that's not very good either. Sometimes it's good to go with what you're ready to do, right? But how do we get it better? How do we get it constantly better? That's what's really important. And so you can really look at your quality assurance. How are you setting up your systems to make sure that quality is there? And then how are you checking it to make sure that what system you have in place is actually working, and to minimize the amount of rework. In construction, the sooner you find something, the better it is. I'll repeat it. The sooner you find it, the better it is. Prevention is the best, all right? But the sooner you find it, then there's less to redo. Inadequate inspections. So if you miss things, lack of observation, big one, like in construction, management by wandering around, making sure you're checking things, making sure you're very observant to things. Again, they crisscross over each other, right? It really is important to make sure that you pay attention to detail. Like I said, a clay brick, a little detail, but it means a lot in the longevity of the product. And if we're just talking about, which I like to strive for, is that continuous improvement and really thinking about a long-term quality job. Sometimes these little things can make a difference between something lasting 5 years and 50 years. And that's a big important aspect. And if you want to build a long-term client relationship, if your clients see everything falling apart after 5 years, yeah, it might got you past the warranty period, but they're going to be thinking twice about who they want to call back, right? And in construction, you want to have 80, 90, 95% of your clients calling you back. You're their contractor. So definitely inadequate inspections. Like, how does this get so far that we missed that this didn't work? Environmental weather damage, flash rain, flash flood, snowstorms on materials that maybe are exposed that shouldn't have been exposed. These types of things cause problems. Water damage if we didn't have something fully protected, and then we've got to rip it out because mold's forming, we've got other problems going on. Major structural failures, well, you hear about those on the news. I could have, I'm sure, pulled in some pictures of bridge collapses and things like that, but usually those things are big news, right? When a bridge collapses in Florida or a bridge collapses in Italy, it's global. Everybody hears about it, right? And so, but sometimes there's smaller structural failures, and they're not complete failures in that the whole thing collapses. It just sags to the point that you got a lot of rework to do. And that becomes a major issue. Again, then how do we avoid that? Well, we have checklists for inspections. We make sure that things are properly tied together. We have excellent communication that goes on between the players that are involved in the project. We have a whole bunch of checks and balances that make sure that we don't miss something of that significance. Scheduling and coordination conflicts. All right, so we have scheduling and we have coordination conflicts. This might be just that we've scheduled things to go in at the same time, or we've scheduled something that goes in ahead of time and then it's in the way of somebody else and then they got to rip it out, or we've got to rip it out and redo it. So again, improvements to our scheduling. This is why in other videos I'll talk about last planner system. And the whole thing about last planner system for scheduling is communication, is collaboration, is engagement. And that helps to reduce a lot of these kind of conflicts. And so you can really advance yourself by paying attention to those elements. Last planner system is an excellent system that by osmosis creates this collaborative, engaging environment. And of course, all the authorities having jurisdiction compliance requirements, inspections, but we're talking about pass inspections here, right? So, or it could be the client's commissioning agent, or that is basically making sure that the building is functioning the way it was designed. If it doesn't, then we have to redo it. So if there's something you're not sure of, best to bring in the inspector ahead of time to make sure it's going to comply. You know, when we talk about commissioning requirements, that's why the best time to start planning for commissioning a building is when you start. Earliest possible time in the pre-construction, in the design phase, start planning for how you're going to close out the commissioning. So when you get there, things pass, or if something doesn't pass, it's not that far from being able to pass. These are important things to consider. So I think that's the first unpacking of the 8 areas of waste. Defects. You'll see as I go on, they interconnect with each other quite a bit. So I'm Tom Stephenson, wishing you a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time. If you haven't clicked subscribe, please do. Leave a comment, maybe some examples of defects that you've run into in construction, suggestions, questions, etc. Again, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.